$1,500. That is the number the Tax Foundation, one of the most respected nonpartisan economic research organizations in the United States, calculated when it added up everything Trump's tariffs are costing the average American household in 2026. Not $1,500 total across the entire trade war. $1,500 this year, on top of the $1,000 the same household paid in 2025, on top of every other price increase that American families have absorbed since January 20th, 2025, when Donald Trump returned to the White House and started building what the Tax Foundation described as the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. $1,500 per household per year. Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger put it in plain language in her Democratic response to Trump's State of the Union address in February 2026. She said, "Since this president took office last year, his reckless trade policies have forced American families to pay more than $1,700 each in tariff costs." When the White House was asked to respond to the Tax Foundation's numbers, spokesman Kush Desai told ABC News that America's average tariff rate had increased by nearly tenfold in the past year. While inflation had actually cooled, real wages had risen, GDP growth had accelerated, and trillions in investments continued pouring in to make and hire in America. He did not dispute the $1,500 figure. He offered a list of other metrics, but he did not say the number was wrong, because it is not wrong. And the part that Washington will not say, the part that the White House press office will not say, that Republican congressional leadership will not say, that Trump himself will not say, is this. A significant portion of that cost is a direct result of the trade war with Canada, the country that was America's largest trading partner for decades, the country that shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States, the country that Trump has called mean and nasty, that he has suggested should become the 51st state of the United States, that he has treated as an economic adversary rather than the closest ally America has ever had. This is that story, the full story. Because the $1,500 figure that economists keep calculating, that Democratic politicians keep citing, that Republican politicians keep not disputing, it has a geography, it has specific causes, and a substantial portion of those causes originate in a decision to start a trade war with the country directly north of the American border. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what the tariffs are actually costing American families, you need to understand how deeply integrated the United States and Canadian economies are, and why disrupting that integration produces costs that fall not on Canadian exporters, but on American consumers. The United States-Canada trade relationship, before Trump's second term, was the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world. More than $700 billion in goods and services cross the border every year. That is $2 billion every single day. More trade in a single day than many countries conduct in a month. The integration was not just large, it was deep in a structural sense that most Americans have never thought about. A car assembled in Michigan does not contain only Michigan-made parts. It contains parts manufactured in Ontario, engine components, transmission parts, interior trim, electronic systems that may have crossed the Canada-US border 4 or 8 or even more times during the manufacturing process, as semi-finished components move between facilities in both countries at different stages of production. The North American auto supply chain is not a chain. It is a web, woven through both countries so tightly that it is genuinely impossible to say where the American part ends and the Canadian part begins. The same is true for lumber. American homes are built with Canadian wood, the softwood lumber from British Columbia and Alberta that frames houses from Maine to Florida. When tariffs go on Canadian lumber, the cost does not stay at the border. It moves directly into the price of every new home, every addition, every renovation. The National Association of Home Builders has estimated that tariffs on Canadian lumber add thousands of dollars to the cost of a new house. Not hundreds, thousands. At a moment when American housing affordability is already at historic lows, and the median home price has reached levels that a generation of younger Americans cannot realistically afford, adding thousands more to the cost of construction is not an abstraction. It is the difference between a house being built and a house not being built. The same is true for oil. Canada supplies more oil to the United States than any other country in the world. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Mexico, more than any of the other suppliers American politicians talk about when they discuss energy independence. That oil flows through pipelines to refineries in the American Midwest that were specifically engineered decades ago to process Alberta heavy crude. They cannot simply switch to a different crude type without major retrofitting that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and take years to complete. When tariffs go on Canadian energy, even at the 10% rate Trump applied rather than the 25% on other goods, those costs move through the refinery and into the price of gasoline at the pump and heating fuel in the tank. In Minnesota and Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin, heating a home through an American winter depends on energy that travels south from Alberta. The tariff on that energy travels south with it. The same is true for steel and aluminum. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of steel and aluminum to American manufacturers. The 50% steel tariff, which is what Trump raised it to in June 2025 when he doubled the original 25%, applies to Canadian metal. The Bank of Canada published a detailed analysis in April 2026 showing that Canadian steel exports to the United States fell by half in 2025. By half. Not declined, not softened, cut in half. American manufacturers who use steel to make machinery, who use aluminum to make aircraft parts, who use either metal to make the structural components of the buildings and bridges and infrastructure of the United States, they paid the tariff when the Canadian metal crossed the border, and they passed it on, because they have no choice, because the tariff is a cost that does not disappear at the factory gate. Now here is the number that most Americans have never seen presented plainly. According to RBC Economics, the research arm of one of Canada's largest banks, doing analysis that is specifically about the economics of both countries, corporate profits for American fabricated metal manufacturers fell 30% between the fourth quarter of 2024 and the second quarter of 2025. 30% in 2 quarters. Because the inputs those manufacturers needed, the Canadian steel and aluminum that they had been sourcing reliably for decades, suddenly cost 50% more to import. And in the first half of 2025, corporate profits for American machinery manufacturers fell by 13%. For American electrical equipment and appliance manufacturers, profits fell 11%. American companies that make the tools and equipment and machines that American workers use in American factories were losing profit at double-digit rates because the inputs they needed from Canada cost more. Those profit losses do not stay on corporate balance sheets. They translate into pricing decisions, hiring decisions, investment decisions. A company that loses 13% of its profits in 6 months is not planning to expand. It is not hiring. It is not building a new facility. In some cases, it is quietly cutting staff. The Tax Foundation's $1,500 calculation is the aggregated result of all of these dynamics working through the economy simultaneously. It is coffee prices rising 33.6% since December 2024. It is ground beef rising 19.3%. It is romaine lettuce rising 16.8%. It is orange juice concentrate rising 12.4%. It is potato chips rising 7.3%. These are not numbers from Canadian press releases. These are numbers from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the American government's own official price tracking agency. And they are happening in every grocery store, every hardware store, every car dealership, every electronics retailer in the United States. Now here is the specific Canada connection that Washington does not advertise. Before Trump's tariffs, approximately 85% of Canadian goods entering the United States did so under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, completely tariff-free. Canada was not a source of price pressure on American consumers. It was a source of price stability. Canadian softwood lumber kept American housing costs lower than they would otherwise be. Canadian steel and aluminum gave American manufacturers reliable, competitively priced inputs. Canadian oil kept Midwest gasoline prices below what they would be if American refineries had to source from more distant suppliers at higher transport costs. When Trump imposed his tariff package on Canada, 25% on steel and aluminum, which was later raised to 50% on steel, he converted a source of price stability into a source of price pressure. The costs that Canadian goods had previously helped suppress were no longer suppressed. They rose. And they rose not for Canadians, but for Americans. Because the tariff is paid by the American importer. It is passed on to the American manufacturer. It is embedded in the price of the American product. It is paid at the American cash register by the American consumer. The United States exported $85 billion worth of goods to Canada in 2024. After Trump's tariffs, U.S. exports to Canada fell by more than 21%. That is not a small number in absolute terms. It represents American workers who used to have jobs making products for Canadian buyers, now without those orders. American businesses that had customers in Canada, now without them. American farmers who sold grain and produce and dairy products in Canadian markets, now facing retaliatory tariffs that have reduced their Canadian sales. Representative Gregory Meeks of the House Foreign Affairs Committee made the case as plainly as any elected official has. He said, "When I go home, my constituents aren't telling me they have an extra $1,700 to spare. They're asking me to lower grocery prices, lower the price of healthcare, and make life more affordable." $1,700. That is the figure Meeks used. The Tax Foundation's number is $1,500. The Yale Budget Lab's estimate for households on the lower end of the income distribution reaches $1,800. Congressional estimates used by multiple House members reach $2,512. Different methodologies, different scopes of analysis, different assumptions about how much of the tariff cost is passed through to consumers. They are all pointing at the same thing. American families are paying more, substantially more, because of a trade war with the country directly north of the border. And not one of those dollars is paid by the Canadian government or by a Canadian company. Every dollar is paid by Americans. Now let's talk about what happened to the industries on the American side that depended most on Canadian goods. Because the cost to consumers is one side of the ledger, the other side is what happened to American industrial capacity. The auto sector illustrates the damage most clearly. The American auto industry imports enormous quantities of parts and components from Canada. Under USMCA, those parts largely cross the border tariff-free because they met the agreement's rules of origin requirements. But the 25% tariff on the non-American content of vehicles, the tariff Trump imposed specifically on the Canadian and Mexican content of cars assembled in North America, created a new cost structure that American automakers absorbed partly in reduced margins and partly in higher prices. Foreign automakers warned the Trump administration directly that they could pull their most affordable models from the American market if the tariff regime continued. And consumer data bore out the concern. Auto prices rose, sales volumes declined. The segment of the market where moderate-income families buy their cars, the affordable sedan, the entry-level crossover, became more expensive precisely when Canadian-built alternatives would have provided price competition. The lumber industry situation was even more acute. New combined tariff rates on Canadian softwood lumber exceeded 40% when October 2025 tariff increases stacked on top of pre-existing countervailing and anti-dumping duties. Canadian lumber production fell 25% from pre-tariff levels. 22 mills closed since 2022. Another 50 were operating at reduced capacity. The reduction in Canadian lumber supply tightened the North American lumber market, pushed prices higher, and embedded additional cost into every American home built since the tariffs took effect. The Bank of Canada's April 2026 analysis found that by February 2026, Canadian lumber exports to the United States were roughly 20% below 2024 averages. That is 20% less Canadian lumber available to American home builders, at a time when the United States is experiencing a housing shortage estimated by industry groups at several million units. Less Canadian lumber means higher lumber prices. Higher lumber prices mean more expensive American homes. More expensive American homes mean more American families who cannot afford to buy one. And the aluminum story contains perhaps the most counterintuitive data point in this entire economic picture. Canadian aluminum exports to the United States initially fell by 50% after the tariffs hit. Then, according to the Bank of Canada, Canadian exports rebounded. They regained over half their initial losses. Why? Because American aluminum inventories ran out. American manufacturers who had switched away from Canadian aluminum to try to avoid the tariff found that the alternative supplies were insufficient. They came back to Canadian aluminum, and they paid the tariff, which means the American aluminum price remained elevated even after the Canadian supply resumed. The tariff did not reduce Canadian aluminum's role in the American market. It raised the price American manufacturers paid for it. The structural dependency did not go away. It just got more expensive. Alex Duranty, senior economist at the Tax Foundation, was direct about the fundamental problem with tariffs as an economic strategy. He told Newsweek, Even from a revenue-raising standpoint, tariffs are not particularly effective because if the tariffs stay in place and supply chains eventually shift back to the US, that would actually cause tariff revenue to fall over the long term. In other words, the tariffs raise money for the government by taxing American consumers now. If they actually succeed in their stated goal, if American domestic production eventually replaces Canadian imports, the tax revenue stream the government has become dependent on disappears. It is a strategy that damages American consumers in the short term and potentially damages the American government's fiscal position in the long term. All in the service of a goal that, even if achieved, eliminates the revenue it was supposed to generate. Trump's tariffs are now the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. They raised $264 billion in customs revenue in calendar year 2025, compared to $79 billion in 2024. That 300% increase in tariff revenue is money that came out of American consumers' purchasing power, American businesses' profit margins, and American workers' real wages. The Pointer fact-check of Governor Spanberger's $1,700 figure concluded it was roughly in line with multiple estimates by groups studying the tariff's effect, representing diverse political ideologies and using different methodologies. The White House keeps saying that inflation has cooled, that real wages have risen, that GDP growth has accelerated, that the tariffs are saving the country. None of those statements addresses the $1,500 number directly. None of them says the figure is wrong, because it is not wrong. It is just a number that for 17 months and counting, Washington has refused to say out loud in the same sentence as the words, "This is what the Canada trade war is costing American families." $1,500 per household, 130 million households, $195 billion extracted from American family budgets every year by a trade war with the country that was America's closest economic partner for the better part of a century. Coffee up 33.6%, ground beef up 19%, lettuce up 17%, orange juice up 12%, houses more expensive, cars more expensive, heating bills higher, grocery runs costlier. The number is not wrong. Washington just will not say it.